welcome all of you, and on behalf of the Institute of Politics and the Harvard Summer School, to introduce Frank Fahrenkopf to the Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Fahrenkopf was born in Brooklyn, raised in Nevada, got his law degree at Berkeley. He is a distinguished attorney, a partner in law firms located both in Reno and in Washington, D.C. He's a friend of the Institute of Politics. We first met him in December 1981 on a conference co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics, by Roger Allen Moore on behalf of the Republican National Committee and by the Democratic National Committee, to examine the role of parties in the nominating process. If you're going to think about reforming the presidential nominating process, what role do parties and what are the effect on parties of changes in that nominating process? And that's when Mr. Fahrenkopf first came, I believe, to the Institute. He was then national chairman of the Republican State Chairmen's Association, and he played a major role at that conference. He led a study group which was concerned lest the national parties and the Congress of the United States lean on state parties unduly and compromise the freedom of state parties to make their own decisions about how delegate selection in the nominating process is designed in the individual states. He was also at that time concerned about the issue of bound and unbound delegates and how much of a rubber stamp convention one ended up with as distinct from a truly deliberative convention. We've kept in touch with him since, and last December, Mr. Fahrenkopf, in his new capacity as Republican, not brand new, but new in terms of coming back to Harvard, in his capacity as chairman of the Republican National Committee, he came to participate in a reconstruction by the various campaign managers of all of the Republican and Democratic campaigns in 1984. How, why, with what impact were the campaign decisions made in 1984? And at that point, Mr. Fahrenkopf was particularly interested in the question, looking ahead to 1988 and beyond, of gerrymandering and redistricting questions, and thinking about party strength at the local and state levels, not just as it happens to be manifested in the electoral system at the time of presidential elections. This year, in January, he was reelected to a second two-year term as the Republican National Committee chairman. I came across recently something that he had said, I think, as a personal philosophical tenet, very brief, which I will read to you. He said, "I believe each of us, as a citizen of this country, has an obligation to serve the community, state, and nation. The rights of citizens and benefits of citizenship must be balanced by a duty to serve others," unquote. Tonight, Mr. Fahrenkopf will speak on the subject of the Republicans after Reagan, and following his talk, he has agreed to engage in a question and answer period, take questions, and at that time, I hope that we'll use the mics so that we can properly record the session. It is my pleasure to welcome Frank Fahrenkopf back to Harvard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that warm welcome. What the hell are you doing in here tonight when it's so gorgeous out there? I wish I was out there along the banks of the river. But it's a great pleasure for me to have an opportunity to return to Cambridge and to appear before an audience at this great institution, which since I have been involved in national politics, has given me a great deal of pleasure and pride to be associated with. It is a place which I truly believe is America's leading institute on politics and what is happening in government in this country. So you should be very proud to be associated with this institution, even if you're just a student on this campus who has the opportunity to share in this establishment's programs and benefits. You know, it was here, really, almost a century ago that William James outlined a philosophy of life based upon the exercise of free will. He was, as most of you know, in fact, an invalid whose first act of free will was to overcome his infirmity. And after having done that, his subsequent act was to present philosophy to us in this nation. And I think it is fitting that James is still regarded by most as America's greatest philosopher, precisely because his philosophy was so American. Free will. And free will, after all, I think, is what our political system, the system that we've enjoyed in this country, is all about. Tonight, as Jonathan indicated, I would like to, and I should warn you, I would like to outline in a partisan fashion, because nonpartisan speeches and presentations are not my forte, at least in the 2.5 years that I have been the national chairman of the Republican Party. But I would like to outline to you where I think this country and the Republican Party is heading after Ronald Reagan. And to do this, I think I must examine some broad historical concepts in history and patterns, not just the election of 1984, not just the election of 1980, but to some extent go back to the foundation of the Republican Party, its birth in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, because that is really where our party began. And to talk to you about something that I have spent a great deal of time talking about, particularly in the last year. And I'm happy to say more and more people are talking about it, and perhaps more importantly, the political philosophers and columnists are now writing about it. I, for some time, felt that I was a lonely voice in the wind when I talked about political realignment. When I first became national chairman, there were very few who agreed with me that there was, in fact, something happening in this country. Something happening called political realignment. Not that it was accomplished, but that it was, in fact, going on. And with your permission this evening, I'd like to talk about, from a historical perspective, because I think it's then important to look at what I think is happening now. The three previous major political realignments that have taken place in this nation. I've come to the conclusion that it is hard circumstances that lead to Americans changing their political party affiliation. But in each and every case, those hard circumstances lead to an exercise by most Americans of free will. Again, back to James. I think James himself said it when he says, in the matter of belief, we are all extreme conservatives. Not in the Republican or Democratic sense, but certainly I think he's right when we're talking about the position that we take. And that is, I think, that the point I'm trying to make is that most people re-examine their beliefs, particularly in the political area, only after compelling, even traumatic events force them to do so. I have, in the last year or so, analogized this to, as you know, Fahrenkopf is not an Irish name, to my heritage, German, something I call the Zeitgeist. The Germans call the Zeitgeist. The spirit of the times, the political spirit of the times is involved when people are faced with the decision of changing political party affiliation and we start discussing realignment. Each nation at a given time experiences a particular zeitgeist, a set of beliefs, a set of circumstances unique to that time and place. This nation's first major political realignment gave birth to the party that I am now the national chairman of. It was very slow in coming at that time. Free Soilers and Whigs had been talking really since the early 1840s in this nation about an alliance. And they eventually formed that alliance along with Northern Democrats who had really become, for lack of better words, fed up with their parties at that time, squeamish compromises on the issue of slavery. And they did unite. But it took, in fact, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 to really ensure the survival of the Republican Party and to give birth to the first real political realignment. Following Lincoln, the Democratic Party again regained power in this nation, but soon another realignment took place in the 1890s. It really was the result of a populist movement in this country. It was really the radicalism, I think, and rhetoric of William Jennings Bryan that, in effect, along with the populist movement, that resulted in the diminishment at that time of the Democratic Party, because it became the Republican Party in 1896 that assumed the mantle of what was known then as muscular progressivism, and the party that was represented by the promise to the American people to bust the trusts and to do those very necessary things of reforming urban politics in the United States. And certainly with the election of Teddy Roosevelt, the direction that the Republican Party was headed at that time was solidified as the party that was really in the vanguard of change in this country. But once again, as we go through these periods that we historically have in this country of change, the mantle of reform was lost during the presidency of the placid, I guess, presidency we could call it, of President Taft, and was eventually passed on to Woodrow Wilson. In the next 20 years after the election of Woodrow Wilson, neither political party really had the opportunity, successfully, really, to get a hold of the American electorate from the standpoint of producing a traumatic or dramatic change, of having a zeitgeist present that would have people move. That was changed, of course, in the 1930s, when, as you know, an abrupt change took place as a result of the Depression. Well, the Great Depression caught everyone off guard in this country politically, radicals, liberals, and conservatives alike. Few credible programs to reverse the economic chaos that we faced were presented by anyone. And no one at that time, until the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was ready to make the commitment to have government step in, government come in and take control of the effort to solve those problems. Well, Franklin Roosevelt did that. He took the side of government intervention and, in effect, resulted, or was the result, of the third major political realignment that we faced. The philosophical chasm created was almost as deep as the Depression. It was a zeitgeist. It was that trauma to our country. And millions of citizens signed up to vote as Democrats, attracted by the personal persona of Franklin Roosevelt, by his programs, and certainly a key issue that ties directly to Ronald Reagan, the view of so many millions of Americans that Franklin Roosevelt was a leader, a strong, personal leader. So quickly, to recap the past, the first realignment occurred when a third party, the Republicans, uprooted an existing party. The second was marked by an absorption of the populists in the 1890s into the system. And the third, fueled by depression, realigned the then two existing parties. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today, in the 1980s, a fourth realignment, I believe, is underway. A realignment that has put the Democrat Party on the defensive and is in the process, from my perspective, of making the Republican Party the majority party in this nation, the party of the future. I think it's important, however, before I go any further, to alert you to something that I try to be alert to when I discuss this subject. And that is, there is always great hazard of using the past to interpret the present. Obviously, the political scene today is dramatically different than that of Abe Lincoln's time or even Teddy Roosevelt's time. Think about this for a moment. I tend to forget it, but think about it. Only a century ago, only men voted in this country. The secret ballot was not common. It was uncommon. Literacy tests were a source of abuse in determining who would vote. Direct primaries didn't exist. United States senators were not elected. They were selected by state legislatures. The voters were poorer and less educated. Party machines were oiled, and patronage and partisanship was much more intense than it is today. Candidates of both sides were presented to the voters in torchlight parades rather than in slick commercials. And television was really at that time nothing more than a Jules Verne type fantasy. Nevertheless, despite these dramatic differences, there has been an amazing degree of continuity over the past 12 decades. With each political realignment, I've got to laugh for a moment because I made a speech in Dallas about a week ago when I was in the middle of it and was interrupted by something almost as bad as that. Booze. With each political realignment, changing political circumstance and changing political philosophy has resulted in changing political affiliation. And each change, each zeitgeist, resolved around a fundamental question. The question in the first realignment in the 1860s was, what do we do about slavery? That was the first question. In the second, in the 1890s, what should government do about the farmers and the distribution of wealth in this country, the populist movement? In the third, what should government do about the Great Depression? Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you the operative question is, what should government do about government? That really is the operative question. I believe that the first seeds of this potential realignment were planted long before the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. I think that they were truly planted perhaps in 1972 when Richard Nixon and George McGovern faced each other in a true philosophical battle for the minds and votes of Americans. But certainly with Watergate blanching the soil, early growth of this realignment was stunted. But I think the realignment process finally took root again in the 1980 election, where the American voters weeded out a philosophy of an all-encompassing government. And again, in 1982, there was some buffeting. As you know, the Republican Party lost 26 seats in the House in 1982. We believe that that was the result of two factors, a recession, as well as something that I'm very interested in. Jonathan talked about, something called gerrymandering that took place in 1981. But that buffeting was not bad. Was not too bad comparatively speaking, since most voters saw it, I think, the recession as a hangover from the Carter-Mondale administration, or felt that really we were going through a very, very drastic cure economically in this country. But enough history. What about the recent election and the present, and more importantly, what can we foresee for the future? Certainly, the figures from the last election, from November 6, 1984, are tremendously promising for the Republican Party and reflective, in my view, of this continuing wave of realignment. As you know, the president carried 49 states. He captured more electoral votes than any candidate for president. When you really think about it, I like to say that in a sardonic type of way, on November 6th, 1984, the voters of this country twisted the predictions of George Orwell. They twisted his predictions by discrediting and overwhelmingly voting against big brother type government, and in effect destroyed the old Roosevelt New Deal coalition, which had held the Democratic Party together. Now, let me tell you why I say that. Geraldine Ferraro was nominated for vice president for a number of reasons. If you talk, as I have and as I know Jonathan has, to many of the Mondale people, one of the reasons certainly was that that campaign needed a shot in the arm very drastically. And I think Geraldine Ferraro provided that shot in the arm. But there were other factors, strictly hardball political factors. Because in terms of the Roosevelt New Deal coalition, Geraldine Ferraro was what we call in Washington a threefer. She was Catholic, she was Italian American, and she was a woman. Three constituencies that the Democratic Party needed, thought were in fact their constituencies, and that the selection of Geraldine Ferraro would cement into the Democratic fold in November of 1984. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to the polls. Those traditional demographic groups that were part of the New Deal coalition fell apart. All of you in this room, if you paid attention to that race, will recall something called the gender gap. That really, I doubt that in my 20 years of involvement in national political politics, there's been two words that have been picked up more by the media and run with, that this was going to dramatically affect the outcome of a presidential election. Well, it did not. In fact, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, by the most accurate exit polls, received 57% of the women's vote in this country. And in fact, there was only one time, one poll, that Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro ever had an edge of even a point among the women voters in this country. And that was the poll taken 2 days after the San Francisco convention adjourned. Gallup had gone in the field for a 1,200 sample, had completed about a 600 sample, and had given a partial report. And if you follow those things, you remember that they were 2 points up 2 days after the convention. That turned around very, very quickly. I had been willing to bet, and my good friend Chuck Manette and I, as we traveled the country with the Chuck and Frankie show during the last year, I was willing to bet him that I was willing to let the American woman voter decide the election at any time. Because our polls showed us overwhelmingly that the majority of women voters in this country did not support Walter Mondale, Geraldine Ferraro, and the philosophy as espoused by the San Francisco Convention. And of course, November 6th proved that to be the truth. Italian American vote, 62% Reagan Bush. Catholic vote, 58% Republican ticket. Part of the New Deal coalition destroyed. Now, this is a young audience, other than for Jonathan. But Jonathan, I'm sure, remembers something called the Solid South. The Solid South. The Solid Democrat South. A given. Any Democrat running for nationwide office could bank it. You added up the electoral votes, you put them in the bank, and you started from there. No longer is there a solid Democrat South. GOP registration in the South today and in the Sun Belt, ladies and gentlemen, I like to say is a growth industry, putting it in economic terms. It truly is, particularly in some major states like North Carolina, Florida, Texas, Louisiana. there are now, believe it or not, more United States senators and members of the House who are Republicans and represent the South than there are from New England. That is a remarkable change. Let me repeat that for a minute. In what's happened in the last 20 years or so, there are now more United States senators and congressmen who are Republican, who represent southern states than represent states of New England. There are 12 United States senators from the South who are Republican. A remarkable, remarkable change in what is happening in this country politically. Among senior citizens, 63% of all voters over 60 supported the Reagan-Bush ticket. There was an awful lot of talk in San Francisco and by Jesse Jackson about something called the Rainbow Coalition. 47% of Hispanics supported Reagan-Bush. Organized labor, a major portion of that traditional coalition. Organized labor did something they had never done before. I was not surprised where they were in November in the general election. They were where we thought they would be, supporting the Democratic nominee. But to go out in the primary season, as the AFL-CIO did, and to take a position in favor of Walter Mondale and against Democrats like Gary Hart and Alan Cranston, who had traditionally been strong supporters of organized labor, was an unheard of thing. And despite Alan Cranston's commitment to, of Lane Kirkland's commitment to deliver 65% of the blue-collar vote to Mondale Ferraro, we captured just over 46% of the blue-collar vote in this country. And in fact, if you discount and eliminate from the labor vote black labor union members, blacks being the one demographic group where we got our clock cleaned, if you eliminate them from the labor vote, over 55% of labor union members in this country supported Reagan-Bush. Again, another element in that coalition that for the last 50 years has formed the basis of Democrat strength. But you don't have to take my word alone that this coalition is dead. Let me quote you again Peter Hart, Walter Mondale's pollster, who says that we are seeing, in fact, the true end of the old liberal coalition. Quote, "The forces that shaped the New Deal coalition and held it together are dead. It is history, and we are moving into a new era," unquote. I want to discuss with you quickly two programs that we in the Republican Party are attempting to implement as a means of taking advantage of what I perceive as this realignment movement. The first you may have been reading about. It's one that's in process now. We call it Operation Open Door. It is a two-stage program, one aimed at asking Democrats who were elected to office as Democrats to switch and become Republicans. We've had remarkable results. We have identified in the last couple of years 200 office holders who were elected as Democrats who have now switched. The other part of Operation Open Door that we're in the middle of right now is asking the rank-and-file Democrat to switch. Operation Open Door is aimed at 4 states, Louisiana, North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania, as pilot states. And I'm in there using the latest computer technology to isolate and find those Democrats who have been supportive of Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Republican candidates, where we have automatic phones in place calling them. We have people going door to door in an effort to learn what the best method is. When I finish this program in mid-August, I'll then take the technology that we've developed in those 4 states, and we will extend it to the other 22 states in the Union that do have party registration. 24 states you do not register by political party. And we've also had some tremendous results from the standpoint of what you would call star quality Democrats making that shift, at least household names. It was a proud moment for me when Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick shared a stage with me in Washington at a press conference when she made the switch. In Texas, former Democratic Congressman Kent Hance, who barely lost the nomination last time out, has made the switch, may run for governor. In the state of Michigan, black Wayne County Executive Bill Lucas has made the switch, may be a candidate for governor. And as you know, right here in your state, a former Democratic governor, Ed King, has made the switch. And while these people are important, more importantly, we are at the local level having sheriffs and judges and county commissioners and city councilmen and state legislators switching political parties. Very, very important from my perspective. A good program, an interesting program that I think portends what may happen if we continue to be successful. The other program is something that I have worked on for the last 2.5 years. It has become known, for lack of a better name, as the 1991 plan. The 1991 plan, because 1991 is a critical date in American politics. Because it is in 1991 that the state legislatures of this nation will next sit down following the 1990 census and will draw the congressional districts that will control the makeup of the House of Representatives for the decade of the 90s. I truly believe that Tip O'Neill is the Speaker of the House today, not because of the will of the American electorate. He is the Speaker of the House because of the skill of Democratic draftsmen in state legislatures in this country in 1981 who created, following the 1980 census, the congressional districts that would dictate the makeup of the House. Let me give you some examples. The state of California has 45 House seats, that one state, 45 House seats. Last November, our candidates for those 45 House seats outpolled the Democratic candidates by almost 2 percentage points. Yet, because of the way the lines were drawn in a plan developed by a genius, we ought to change the word gerrymander to Burtonmander, because late Democratic Congressman Phil Burton of California drew the districts in California that although we got more votes, the Democrats got 60% of the 45 House seats. We only got 40% of the House seats. If you look back nationwide at the 435 races for the House last time, you'll find that the two political parties almost came out dead even. The Democrats did get more votes than we did, but we only got 42% of the seats. They got 58% of the seats because of the way the district lines were drawn. The 1991 plan that I've had in place for a couple of years and that we're going to continue working on is aimed very clearly up front at gaining control of the reapportionment process by 1991, by taking control of a majority of state legislative chambers in this country by that process, so that we are the ones drawing the lines. Now, that plan has been in place for some time, and we've had remarkable success already. We had a net gain on November 6th of 325 state legislative seats across this country. We took control of 7 legislative chambers that we had not controlled before November 6th. We are now within 10 seats of controlling 20 other legislative chambers in this country. And we're well on the way of attempting, through the rebuilding of the state and local party organizations, with the use of resources, manpower, and expertise, computer capability, to rebuild the infrastructure of the Republican Party organizationally in this country. We've had something occur, however, that Roger Allen Moore is certainly aware of that may shorten that process. And it sort of is an interesting thing, although some of my friends in Indiana are not so sure. Let me just quickly share it with you because you'll be reading about it. The Democratic Party in the state of Indiana filed suit in the federal court in Indiana against the Republican Party, claiming that the Republican state legislature in Indiana had unfairly, in the creation of state legislative districts, gerrymandered for political purposes the district lines. The 3-judge panel in Indiana agreed that the Republican Party in the Indiana state legislature had done that. The Democrat Party was, of course, happy. The Republican Party of Indiana appealed the case to the United States Supreme Court, and that court has accepted jurisdiction. The Republican National Committee has filed an amicus brief in that case. While we haven't really taken sides, if you really look at it in a way, we're leaning more towards the Democrat side than we are the Republican side. For one very good reason. If the Supreme Court upholds what the federal court did in Indiana and strikes down the districts and sets forth standards, we believe it could affect the congressional lines in somewhere between 30 and 40 states and would require state legislatures to redraw congressional districts prior to 1991. An important case. We have control of the Senate. I want control of the House. Now, there are many who spend their time at institutions like this, and many who write, who say, well, the odds are against the Republicans for one very, very important historical reason. That is called the 6-year itch. The 6-year itch, for those who follow these things, is basically the theory that in the 6th year of 2-term presidencies, the mid-term election in the 2nd term of a 2-term presidency is disaster for the party in the White House. And if you look back over the last 30 years, you'll find that that is the case. That the party in power in the White House at 6-year itch time has lost on the average of 7 United States Senate seats, 7 governorships, and 48 seats in the House of Representatives. Next year is the 6th year of the 2-term presidency of Ronald Reagan. And there are many Democrats who are really in many ways licking their chops at that prospect. They're also licking their chops at the prospect of the United States Senate. As you know, a switch, a net gain of 4 seats to the Democratic side will give control of the United States Senate to the Democratic Party. A net gain of 4. There are 34 United States Senate seats up in 1986. Of the 34, 22 of them are Republican seats. Only 12 are Democratic seats. Of the 22 Republican seats, 16 of them are freshmen Republican United States senators who are running for re-election for the first time. Well, I happen to think that's good news. And let me tell you why. Freshmen of either political party are usually hungry. Freshmen like their jobs. Freshmen tend to do their constituency work. Freshmen come home on weekends. Freshmen take care of the people who elected them. It is 2nd, 3rd, and 4th termers who tend to become part of what we call in Washington the Beltway mentality, who become more and more part of D.C., Maryland, and Virginia than they do their home state. I like to say you will find freshmen on the 4th of July in their home state riding in a parade. You'll find the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th termers in the United States Senate in the shadow of the Washington Monument on the Mall listening to the Beach Boys or Wayne Newton. In the last 25 years, 100 United States Senate seats have turned over for any manner of reasons. Only 20 are freshmen of either political party who have run for re-election and been defeated. So the fact that 16 are in fact freshmen is good. Is good from my perspective. You know, I think freshmen realize that if you don't do your job, you don't handle your constituents, you can go from being in who's who very quickly into who's that. And they don't want that to happen. Plus, we have an opportunity among the 12 Democrats. There are 2 open Democrat seats with the retirement of Senator Eagleton in Missouri and Senator Long in Louisiana. My own personal view that I've stated on a number of occasions is that there will be a 3rd open seat in the great western state of Colorado. I do not believe that Gary Hart will run for re-election in the United States Senate. I don't think he can afford to do so. He owes about $3 million still from his last campaign, and he barely won election in '80. He does want the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1988, so I think when he really looks at the cards, he'll decide that rather than trying to raise money to pay off $3 million in debts from the '84 run, trying to raise money to run for the Senate in '86, and then having to go out and raise money for 1988, that he may very well step down at the end of this term and concentrate his resources and attention on getting the nomination. Well, I think the numbers that I've indicated to you and the trends I've tried to show you are not, however, very convincing to the point of realignment. I just, in closing, want to touch a couple of others because I want to leave time for plenty of questions. There are some interesting changes statistically in a very important question, and that is how the American electorate identifies themselves as Republicans or Democrats or independents. For the last 50 years in this country, up until about 1982, it has been pretty consistent. About 50% of the electorate have said that they're Democrats. 25% of the electorate have said that they're Republicans, and the other 25% have basically said that they're independents, they're non-affiliated. That has changed. Every single poll since November has indicated that for the first time in 50 years, the two major political parties in this country are at parity. We're within the margin of error of polling with regard to party identification. As many people in this country today say they're Republicans as say they're Democrats. That is a remarkable change. And along with that change, most of the polls indicate that perception has changed. I have lectured often my fellow Republicans about an image problem that I've felt we've had. I call it, for lack of a better description, as the Roosevelt Albatross. That albatross being an image that the Republican Party is the party of corporations, of rich people, the country club image, that all Democrats are poor and that all Republicans are rich. I've often wanted to debate Averell Harriman and Ted Kennedy on that, but I haven't had the opportunity. But that is an image problem that we have had, that we do not care about the average American because we're all too busy driving our Mercedes and playing golf at the country club. That has truly been an image problem. That, finally, is starting to change. For the first time since George Gallup has been asking the question, the Republican Party comes out ahead on the question of, number one, which political party in the United States today is the best party to keep our nation's economy healthy, expanding, and vibrant? Republican Party. The second part, which political party is the best party to keep the peace? Interesting. For the first time since 1951, the Republican Party is head and shoulders above the Democratic Party on both questions among the American electorate. Third question, which political party do you believe is best able to deal with the problems facing America today and in the future? Answer, Republican Party. And perhaps the more pertinent question, from my perspective as the national chairman of the Republican Party, which political party best represents today what you believe in and want for this country and what your friends and neighbors believe in and want for this country? Republican Party. Ladies and gentlemen, those are dramatic changes. They are cataclysmic changes. Those are realignment changes. And I think the electorate in the last election, by their vote, showed that. But to me as national chairman, nothing points more toward my thesis of a fourth realignment than the fact that today the Republican Party has become the party of young America. Let me share with you some fascinating numbers. Last November 6th, Ronald Reagan and George Bush captured 61% of the vote of people under 40. And among young first-time voters, the ticket captured 68% of the vote. Peter Hart completed a study of all new registrants in the last 2 years in this country. Now, that does not only include young people. It includes people in some states who have been purged from the rolls. If you don't vote in some states, you're eliminated from the rolls and you must re-register. But among all new registrants in the last 2 years, 49% describe themselves as Republicans, only 38% as Democrats. Now, let me tell you where that's important. That has very little to do with presidential politics. It has very little to do with senatorial politics or gubernatorial politics. Where that is important is at the lower end of the ballot, at state and local government, because it is at state and local government where party affiliation dramatically affects voting attitudes and behavior. Because very often voters go into that booth, and when they're choosing between people for City Hall, the county courthouse, excuse me, even the state legislature, they very often don't know the merits of the two candidates. Either because that particular race or set of races have been low budget from the standpoint of communication to the electorate of what the people stand for and want to achieve, or alternatively, those races get lost in the clamor and hullabaloo and PR of presidential politics, senatorial politics, gubernatorial and congressional politics. And it is at that point that our studies show up to us that people tend to vote more often as they are registered. And in the last 50 years in this country, 80 to 85% of the American people have remained in the party that they have first registered in. And if you go back 50 years, you realize, 50 or 60 years, we're now talking about New Deal registrants. People who registered to vote for the first time during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, and overwhelmingly registered as Democrats. So the fact that now, today, we are seeing a majority of young people registering for the first time, and in parts of this country, it's 2-to-1 Republican over Democrat among young registrants, indicates to me that the future is perhaps, because these things can change, and I'm always aware of that, is ours, is my party's. Now, I understand today that on many college campuses, and perhaps on this campus, the meaning of this trend is very hotly debated. There are many who say that today's youth lacks commitment, lacks social conscience, lacks outside interest, and that youth's only interest today is gross materialism. This common refrain, often heard from Democrats, is that today's youth have no understanding or appreciation of the great deeds performed by the radical leaders of the 1960s. Tom Hayden, for example, seems mystified lately that there is so little support for his proposal to erect a memorial in Washington to commemorate the protesters of the 60s. The liberal caricature, I think, of today's generation is perhaps most graphically personified by Steve Dallas. Steve Dallas, the ultra-materialistic, status-conscious fraternity boy in Bloom County. Steve Dallas cares about nothing except having enough Izod shirts to wear, a fast car to wreck, and an available girl to annoy. In short, Steve Dallas is a boozer, he's a bigot, and he's a bore. But he also, I submit, bears as little resemblance to the current generation as Tom Hayden's proposed protester monument, another caricature, I submit, bears to that of most Americans who grew up in the 60s. Today's students are no more selfish or materialistic than the previous generation was altruistic. But let me tell you something. These are different times for those of you who attend college. Times have changed. We're not living in the 60s. We're living in the 80s. College entrance standards have been, as you know, tightened. I have a daughter who attends a university. I have a daughter who is a senior in high school, and all I hear anymore is SAT scores and achievement scores. And I'm sure there are many in this audience who remembers that crunch. Scholarships are based on competitive standards. And I think, as you probably realize, the old easy A has gone the way of the dinosaur. The job market today is booming. It is booming currently. Certainly in Massachusetts it is. With more Americans at work today than at any time in the past. But a college degree is no longer a safe passport to a job. Certainly not to a steady job in a service-oriented economy. It is a risky, rapidly changing job environment. Today's college graduate has to hustle to get a job, and they have to hustle to keep it once they have it. In short, I thought about this a great deal when I was preparing these remarks. If the movie The Graduate were being made today, I submit to you that Dustin Hoffman would be very grateful to get the inside word on plastics. Think about it next time you see that movie. But again, I don't think that it's because this generation is more materialistic or greedy, nor are you any less committed to improving the world that is passed on to you. The times have changed. There is a new reality. There is a new zeitgeist, not only in America, there is a new zeitgeist in the world. In my own experience, as Jonathan told you, I attended Cal Berkeley from 1962 to 1965. Free speech movement. I was there, and I can tell you it was no time to be a conservative or a Republican. But I was invited back to the Berkeley campus last election. Remarkable change at Berkeley and in many college campuses, because we're seeing conservative clubs, we're seeing college Republican organizations, we're seeing a rebirth of a conservative view. Interestingly enough, and I think it's a failing, when I grew up in politics, there were young Republicans and young Democrats, and it was very competitive. The YDs have had difficulty getting back up and operating, and that is a change. I think today that the young people in this country are coming to realize that the best way to redress inequality, to achieve social equality, is to have a strong, growing, expanding economy. That must be the basis of those desirable goals. And certainly we need social programs. We need aid to families with dependent children. We need food stamp programs. We need housing programs. But ladies and gentlemen, we need more than that. And I think, in my travels, that young America sees clearly that the expenditure of $1 trillion on social welfare programs in the last decade left many underprivileged and poor Americans just as bad off as they were before the expenditure. Certainly you do not question the need for welfare or social support, but I think you do ask whether or not there isn't a better way to administer it and better programs. I happen to believe that a robust economy provides millions of new jobs for Americans. It provides shelter for the homeless. It feeds the hungry. It opens the door to opportunity for all Americans. And you know, we tend to forget. I want to try a little test if I can. Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th, 1981. That followed 4 years of Democratic control of the administration, of a Democrat president and vice president. It followed, I forget how many years of Democrat control of the Senate, 30 or 40. It followed, at that time, control of the House, which is still controlled and has been for like 35, 36 years by the Democrats. What was the prime interest rate on the day that Ronald Reagan raised his right hand and took the oath of office on the west front of the Capitol of the United States of America? Anyone remember? No? Getting close. The prime rate was 21.5. Prime rate was 21.5. Oh, we'll talk about deficit. You can ask me that question, because I'll talk to you about that. 21.5 was the prime rate. What was GNP growth in the last year of the Carter-Mondale administration? GNP growth was negative, a negative 0.6%. We just finished in 1984 the best GNP growth year in our country's history since 1951, 6.9%. 51, we were in the middle of the Korean War. We talk about double-digit inflation at the time our president took the oath of office, and people talk in terms of 12 or 13%. But if you talk about necessities, if you talk about clothing, food, heating, those type of necessities, the inflation rate was more like 22%. We've just finished the third year in a row with inflation at 4 or below. That is what I believe the American people voted for and supported. I think it's tremendously important that, and while my party is sometimes criticized for it, we believe that a strong economy is the best training program, it's the best jobs program, it's the best housing program, it's the best welfare program. Today, I ask you another question. What does the Democratic Party offer in the decade of the 80s and 90s other than criticism as a solution? Criticism is all. I like to, my good friend Paul Kirk, I shared this with him the other day. Winston Churchill, I think, made a remark describing the labor government of Chamberlain, which really describes the Democratic Party of today. Here's what Churchill said about the labor government. He said, "They are decided only to be undecided. They are resolved to be irresolute. They are adamant for drift. And they are all-powerful for impotency." I think that is an apt description of what is going on in the Democratic Party today. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. Paul Maslin, Cambridge Research, Pat Caddell's partner up until, I guess, a month ago, recently analyzed it as follows. Democratic poster, not a Republican. Here's what Paul said. "The Republican Party is seen today as the party of change, progress, growth, strength, and the national interest. Democrats are increasingly seen as the party of the status quo, no growth, harking to the past, weakness, and is being tied to a variety of special interest groups." Well, let me say this in conclusion. I hope that Paul Kirk is successful in bringing the Democratic Party back, and I say that sincerely. I happen to be a firm believer in the two-party system. And I no more want an all-powerful Republican Party in the future than I'm happy with an all-powerful Democratic Party. I think it's unhealthy. I think the give and take that our society provides us with in a two-party system is healthy. And so I wish him well. And let me say this to you. I hope that all of you in this room will sincerely get involved in party politics. Don't be turned off. Don't believe in de-alignment. Realign. I don't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat. Get involved in the system. Get involved in party politics. It is easy. It is not a dark, mysterious, unethical place. There is opportunity. Both political parties want involvement, want new people, and want new ideas. Don't be afraid to get involved. I have a personal philosophy that I think best says it. And it quotes a Bostonian, former departed now, Cardinal Cushing. Here's what he said, and I think it's very apt for young people, and I still think I'm young, in approaching not only politics but life. Here's what he said. "A great deal of talent is lost in the world for want of a little courage. Every day sends to their graves obscure men and women whom timidity prevented from making a first effort, who, if they could have been induced to begin, would have had, in all probability, gone to great lengths in the career of fame. The fact is that to do anything in the world worth doing, we must not stand back shivering and thinking of the cold and the danger. We must jump in and scramble through as well as we can. I certainly hope that all of you will jump in and scramble in the two-party system. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and
Those of you who would like to ask Mr. Fahrenkopf some questions, please come to the mics on far right and far left and far right of the room, or the mics in the second deck that are positioned for this purpose, and he has agreed to take questions.
yes, sir.
Yeah, I hope to by sometime before the end of 1985 either inspire the formation or start the formation of a World Environmental Protection Agency. And I was wondering what the Republican Party feels on this type of activity.
Well, the Environmental Protection Agency and environmental issues, in my view, are not partisan. If you look through the members of Congress of both political parties, Republican and Democrat, and not only in Congress, but certainly through leadership at the state and local level, where perhaps it impacts more than anywhere else. I mean, toxic waste sites are located in states and in cities and in counties. And I personally, because I have children and I hope to have grandchildren, want to do everything that I personally can to ensure that they have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and a society that they can live in without fear. That's not easy in today's world. That's the contrasting balance we have to.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could I rephrase
Sure,
that?
you
I was wondering what your advice would be if I wanted to go about doing this. Since it is a nonpartisan issue.
I would. I'll tell you what I would do. Is I would visit the EPA. I would, perhaps more importantly, find a United States senator or two who believed and support what you believe in, and I would get them to assist.
Okay, well, I want advice from the United States, but I'm talking on a world scale, so I don't want it to be just American. I want to involve the world.
You better start here first before you better have a base here.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know, how do you explain the absence of support from the black American voter for the Republican Party, and what are you doing to win that support?
I think that, well, I've been chairman for 2.5 years. The biggest disappointment